The palace smelled of roses and smoke. At first, the women thought the fragrance was another indulgence of their master. Garlands of petals scattered across their silken sheets. But then the air grew thick. Flames licked the curtains. The door was bolted from the outside. Their screams rose against the marble walls, echoing into the night. And at the center of it all, an emperor, watching, detached, as beauty became ash. This was not the story of war, not rebellion, but of a ruler who treated his own harem not as women, but as candles to be extinguished for his pleasure. If history's darkest truths disturb you, and they should, subscribe now. Comment where you're watching from, because tonight we enter the forbidden chambers of an emperor who turned passion into pyres. History has a way of dressing emperors in marble and gold, preserving only their victories and monuments. Yet behind the carved stone, behind the praises of poets and the propaganda of coins, lie whispers. Whispers of rituals so shocking that chroniclers barely dared to ink them. Our story begins with one such whisper. The tale of an emperor who set fire not to his enemies, but to his lovers. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, there was an emperor of Rome who transformed his bedchamber into a furnace of cruelty. His concubines, chosen from across the empire, adorned in silks, perfumed with oils, were not companions. They were captives, and sometimes they were victims of a ritual that blurred the line between passion and execution. Picture the scene. A palace wing heavy with the scent of roses, jasmine, and burning incense. Gilded lamps line the walls, casting golden light upon marble floors. Behind closed doors, young women lie on couches, whispering to one another, their laughter brittle, their eyes darting toward the guards outside. They have been summoned by the emperor himself. Some tremble with fear, others force smiles, still hoping for favor. And then, the shift. The sound of bolts sliding into place. Heavy iron locking the doors from the outside. A sudden hush. The scent changes. No longer roses but oil. No longer incense but smoke. One woman rushes to the curtains, tugging at the fabric, only to find fire already crawling up the threads. Another beats at the door screaming. The marble amplifies their cries, echoing like prayers unanswered. This was not an accident. It was theatre. And the emperor, it is said, sometimes stood in the hallway, listening. Sometimes he lingered within, lyre in hand, watching flames devour flesh as if it were performance art. A senator who dared to comment whispered later, "He loved not their bodies, but their burning." But who was this man? Was he a lunatic scribbled into history by angry writers? Or was he truly the tyrant who made bonfires of his own bedchamber? Most historians agree that the figure in question was Nero Claudius Caesar, the last of the Julio-Claudian line. Yet whether the acts were fact, embellishment, or rumor, the persistence of the story tells us something vital. Rome itself believed it possible, because Rome knew Nero's appetites. He was the emperor who, according to Tacitus, adored performance above politics. The man who would rather sing on a stage than lead an army. The ruler accused of playing his lyre as Rome itself burned. If he could turn his city into a torch, why not the women in his palace? This is the horror that Rome could not cleanse from memory, even when it tried. Imagined eyewitness. Servant's voice, hushed. "I carried the wine. I saw them led inside. They were laughing, perfumed, hopeful. When the bolts slammed shut, their laughter died. Smoke slipped through the cracks before the screams began. We were told to stand guard, not to move, not to help." He wanted silence, except for their cries. The scandal was more than cruelty. It was inversion. A bed, meant to be a place of love, or at least of alliance, became a funeral pyre. Women, chosen for beauty, were consumed by the very emperor who had sought them. And the act itself carried meaning, not simply destruction, but domination. In Roman law, a concubine was property. In the emperor's mind, perhaps, property could be consumed like wood, like oil, like a candle. But why did the record survive? Why not erase it, as so many shameful truths were erased? Because Rome was a city of gossip. Senators recorded whispers. Soldiers carried tales back to their families. And historians like Suetonius lived for scandal. For them, Nero's cruelty was a warning. What happens when an emperor confuses art with atrocity? Thus the rumor endured, that Nero had burned his concubines alive in their beds. Aphoristic transition. His bed was not for love, it was for fire. Imagine the silence of the aftermath, the stone walls blackened with soot, the air heavy with the stench of charred silk. Guards opening the chamber doors to find only ash, twisted jewelry, melted gold. And the emperor, unmoved, demanding musicians to play as if the night had been nothing but a banquet. One courtier later confessed, "We clapped when he asked, we smiled when he sang, but in our eyes terror lived." For if concubines could burn, what of senators? This is the scandal they tried to bury, a crime against intimacy, against trust, against the very idea of empire as a family. Rome prided itself on pietas, duty, loyalty, reverence. Yet here was an emperor who inverted that virtue into spectacle. For his concubines, there was no reverence, no safety, only fire. And yet, this was only the beginning. To understand how such cruelty could emerge, we must step beyond the locked doors of the harem and into the larger world of Rome itself, a world where violence and pleasure walked hand in hand. To grasp how a ruler could lock his concubines into burning chambers and still be remembered as an emperor, we must step into the Roman world itself. Rome was a civilization of contradictions, a society that exalted liberty while maintaining millions in chains, that worshipped gods of love while turning intimacy into property, that built aqueducts and colosseums with the same hands that crucified rebels by the thousands. In such a world, cruelty did not hide. It was entertainment, the amphitheater. Tens of thousands gather, their cheers shaking the stone. Below them, two gladiators fight until blood stains the sand. In another corner, a lion drags a screaming prisoner across the arena floor. The emperor watches, nods, perhaps even smiles. Violence was not shameful. It was theatre. It was Rome's heartbeat. When brutality was daily spectacle, when the suffering of others was woven into civic pride, how surprising is it that cruelty also entered the private bedchamber of Rome's rulers? In Roman households, particularly among the elite, women were divided by rank: wives, concubines, and slaves. Wives held legal dignity, but little power, often chosen for alliance rather than affection. Concubines, however, occupied a fragile space. They were not wives, but neither were they mere household slaves. They were, as jurist Ulpian once wrote, companions without ceremony. Concubines could be taken from conquered peoples. Greek, Syrian Gaulish girls carried to Rome in chains, then polished into palace ornaments. They might be daughters of lesser nobles, offered to curry favour. To be chosen was, in public, an honour. In private, it was often a sentence. We were taught silence, to walk with lowered eyes, to dress in silks that covered everything but protected nothing. Our smiles were part of our duty. We belonged to him, body and breath alike. Roman men enjoyed sexual freedom that bordered on lawlessness. Senators boasted of their mistresses. Generals brought lovers from campaigns. What mattered was not fidelity but control. A man's honour was measured not by his restraint, but by his domination. Women, by contrast, were judged by chastity, obedience, and silence. For a woman in the emperor's orbit, there was no path of resistance. To refuse was treason. To submit was survival. To be chosen was to vanish behind the palace doors, one more body absorbed into the emperor's will. And in the case of Nero, or the emperor described by Suetonius's rumour, submission was not enough. His desire was not satisfied by possession alone. It demanded destruction. Here lies another clue. Fire in Rome was more than an element. It was a symbol. Fire cleansed, destroyed, renewed. The hearth of Vesta burned eternally in the Forum, symbolizing Rome's life. To extinguish it was sacrilege, but fire was also fear. The city's tightly packed wooden tenements burned frequently. Families could be destroyed in a night. The Great Fire of 64 CE, which consumed most of Rome, scarred the collective imagination forever. Nero's rumoured burning of his concubines must be seen against this backdrop. To use fire against women was not just cruelty, it was symbolism. He was imitating the city's terror in miniature, turning human bodies into vessels of destruction. His palace became a second Rome in flames, one he controlled. But how did such a man rise? How did a boy, born into the house of emperors, become a ruler who turned love into smoke? Part of the answer lies in the culture that raised him. The Roman elite believed themselves destined for dominance. Sons of noble houses were told from childhood that their will was law. Their mothers, sisters, even tutors reinforced the idea that the boys' desires were divinely sanctioned. Combine this entitlement with an empire stretching across continents, funneling wealth and slaves into Rome, and you create rulers for whom nothing, not even human life, carried weight. Add to this the peculiar Roman blend of superstition and art. Nero adored Greek theatre, poetry, and music. He longed to be seen not as a statesman but as an artist. And art, in his twisted vision, required sacrifice. If gladiators bled for Rome's applause, why not concubines for his private stage? He told us once, beauty must end in tragedy. We thought he spoke of poetry. Later, we learned he meant women. Where law ends, spectacle begins. So when the whispers began, that Nero locked concubines in burning chambers, they were not dismissed outright. Rome believed them because Rome understood him. It was not outside the logic of empire. It was empire distilled. The scandal of burning women alive was not a crack in the system. It was the system unmasked. A world where dominance was everything, where spectacle excused cruelty, where women were shadows at the edge of the torchlight, until they themselves became torches. But how did this man, this artist of fire, this emperor of spectacle, come to power at all? What path carried Nero from promising heir to tyrant, feared by his own household? To answer, we must trace his rise, from boy to emperor, from student to sadist. He was not born to rule. Nero Claudius Caesar entered the world in 37 CE, a boy entangled in the ambitions of others. His father died young. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, clawed her way through Rome's corridors of power like a tigress among wolves. Agrippina was no ordinary Roman woman. She was the sister of Caligula, the emperor infamous for his cruelty, and the niece of Emperor Claudius, whom she would eventually marry. In her son, she saw not a child, but an heir, a future instrument of her domination. From his earliest days, Nero was groomed in contradictions. On one side stood Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, hired as his tutor. Seneca taught restraint, wisdom, the pursuit of virtue above pleasure. On the other side was Agrippina, whispering of destiny, of thrones, of the Julio-Claudian bloodline that gave him near-divine right to rule. Between Stoic discipline and imperial ambition, the boy learned not balance, but performance. He learned to wear masks, to play the dutiful son when watched, to play the indulgent heir when unobserved. By 16, he was adopted by Emperor Claudius. By 17, he married his stepsister, Octavia, as politics demanded. By 17, he was also surrounded by shadows, courtiers who feared Agrippina, generals who resented her influence, senators who whispered that the boy was too soft for war, too enamored with Greek culture, too indulgent in song and poetry. But power in Rome was not given to the worthy. It was seized by the ruthless. And with Agrippina's machinations, Nero ascended the throne in 54 CE. He was only 17 years old. At first, there was hope. The young emperor, guided by Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, presented himself as generous, approachable, almost modest compared to the paranoia of Claudius or the madness of Caligula. The people cheered him. Coins bore his image with olive wreaths. Bread was distributed freely. Festivals multiplied. Rome believed it had a benevolent ruler, but within the palace walls, another Nero stirred. The one shaped by Agrippina's suffocating control. The one who longed not to govern, but to perform. It began with quarrels. Agrippina, who had maneuvered her son into power, demanded she remain the true hand behind the throne. She entered the palace unannounced, held court in her son's name, dismissed his advisors as if they were her servants. For Nero, the throne became a cage, his mother the jailer. And when a ruler feels caged, cruelty is born. The first victim was Agrippina herself. At first, he distanced her, stripping her of influence. But she would not be silent. She reminded him of his debt, of her power, of her ability to replace him if he disobeyed. Some sources claim she threatened to elevate Britannicus, the son of Claudius, in Nero's place. The boy emperor, already insecure, grew paranoid. And paranoia is the soil where tyranny takes root. According to Tacitus, Nero arranged his mother's death with theatrical precision. A banquet invitation, a staged accident at sea, the boat collapsing under her chamber, designed to drown her while he remained blameless. Agrippina swam to shore, bloodied but alive. When news reached Nero, he panicked. He ordered assassins. She was cut down in her villa, stabbed in her womb, a cruel irony, as if erasing the very origin of his life. When word reached him, Nero did not weep. He compared himself to Orestes, the mythical son who killed his mother, and declared himself free. It was then, historians suggest, that the mask cracked. With his mother gone, with Seneca's influence waning, Nero was unchained. He no longer pretended to be Rome's servant. He became Rome's performer. He paraded through the streets dressed as a charioteer, sang before audiences for hours, forced senators to applaud his plays. His palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was built not as a home, but as a stage, adorned with gilded ceilings, mosaics of flame, banquet halls where night and day were blurred by lamplight. Rome was not his empire, it was his theatre, and in this theatre, women became props. His marriage to Octavia soured. She was accused of sterility, confined, and eventually executed. Poppaea Sabina, his mistress and later wife, replaced her. Poppaea was beautiful, ambitious, and skilled at manipulation. But even she, according to rumour, was struck down when she argued with him. Her life ended by a kick to her womb while pregnant. If wives could die at his whim, what safety had concubines? This is the man who, when the Great Fire of Rome swept through the city in 64 CE, was accused of playing his lyre as flames consumed neighbourhoods. Though likely propaganda, the story fit him, because by then everyone knew of his obsession with fire. He rebuilt the city not with humility, but with grandeur, erecting his golden house on land cleared by flame. And so, the whispers grew. If Nero could burn his city, could he not burn his lovers? If he could stage his mother's murder, could he not stage the fiery deaths of concubines as private theatre? Suetonius hints, Cassius Dio repeats, chambers set ablaze, women trapped inside. Whether true or exaggerated, Rome believed it, and belief, for history, is as powerful as fact. Here, the pattern emerges. The boy raised between philosophy and ambition became the man who turned both into performance. He performed virtue until his mother's shadow threatened him. He performed freedom by murdering her. He performed art by forcing Rome to listen. And in the darkest corners of his palace, he performed cruelty with fire. What he could not control, he destroyed. What he could not love, he consumed. The palace by night was a world apart. Outside, Rome bustled with taverns, markets, and theatres. But within the marble walls, silence reigned. A silence broken only by music, the rustle of silk, the crackle of lamps. Here, the emperor staged his darkest dramas. According to Cassius Dio, some concubines were brought to his private banquets, bathed in oils, dressed in translucent gowns, their hair braided with gold threads. They were seated at his side, offered jewels and wine, while musicians played on lyres. Guests whispered that these girls were chosen not merely for beauty, but for obedience. They smiled on command, poured his drink, endured his touch. Yet when the feast ended, the true performance began. Guards escorted the women to chambers specially prepared. Silk curtains hung heavy, lamps burned bright. They lay down on couches of ivory and cedar, expecting another night of ritual intimacy. Then came the sound, the bolts slamming shut, the shift in the air, the sudden sharp smell of oil, curtains igniting like paper touched to a torch. At first they thought it an accident, until they heard laughter echoing beyond the door. Some clawed at the walls. Some screamed prayers to Venus, Juno, any goddess who might hear. The flames licked higher, devouring fabric, hair, breath. Witnesses later claimed Nero listened as if to music, sometimes strumming his own lyre to match the rhythm of their cries. He did not call it murder, he called it art. One palace servant, speaking years later under another emperor, swore he saw bracelets melted into skin, anklets fused to bone, the air filled with both perfume and stench. When asked why no one intervened, he answered simply, "The emperor commanded silence." In Rome, to break silence against the will of Caesar was a death sentence. The cruelty did not stop at single chambers. Some stories tell of entire rooms prepared like funeral pyres, beds arranged in rows, kindling hidden beneath sheets, wine poured out not as drink, but as accelerant. Women were led inside together, told to rest, told to await his arrival. Instead, heat rose from below, and by the time the first realized, it was too late. Their bodies became torches for a ruler who adored spectacle. Was it all true, or rumor sharpened into legend? Historians today debate. Tacitus, cautious, writes less of the harem and more of Nero's fire-consuming Rome. Suetonius and Dio, eager for scandal, preserve the whispers of his cruelty to women. But in either case, the fact that Rome believed these stories reveals something darker than the act itself. Nero was so steeped in excess, so enamored with destruction, that even atrocity seemed plausible. Eyewitnesses, imagined or real, give the story breath. A senator wrote in secret notes, he wished not to hold their beauty, but to watch it vanish. Another courtier claimed he saw Nero emerge from the smoke, his cloak perfumed, his eyes alight, declaring, now that is tragedy. If invention, it still fits the man. If truth, it shows the depths to which he sank. For the concubines, there was no choice. They were property in the eyes of the law, gifts of conquest or tribute. To be chosen by the emperor was honor in public and terror in private. Refusal was treason. Submission was no guarantee of safety. Some lived, favored for a time, until their novelty faded. Others vanished into smoke, their names unrecorded, their ashes swept from marble floors before dawn. The palace itself bore the scars. Blackened walls scrubbed, burned draperies replaced with new silks, the stench masked with incense and rosewater. The cruelty was buried beneath perfumes, but memory clung to servants and guards. They whispered, in shadows, their words spreading to senators, to writers, to history itself. For him, love ended in smoke. The acts were not crimes of passion. They were deliberate, rehearsed, staged. A ruler obsessed with performance turned death into theatre, women into props, fire into applause. And every time Rome heard the story, repeated, whether true or exaggerated, it confirmed what they already feared, that their emperor saw them all, senators, soldiers, citizens, as nothing more than an audience to his cruelty. The women burned in silence, but their screams echoed in history. Why fire? Why transform women, concubines, even wives into vessels of smoke and ash? To answer, we must step not into the palace, but into the emperor's mind. Nero was not remembered as a soldier or builder. He was remembered as a performer. He once declared, "What an artist dies in me," as if the collapse of his reign was less a political disaster than a missed performance. For Nero, life itself was a stage, and the people closest to him were, not companions but actors, cast in roles they could never escape. To understand the psychology of such a ruler, we must begin with his obsession with art. Nero adored the theatre. He sang, he acted, he played the lyre for audiences forced to listen for hours. Senators who nodded off were jolted awake by guards. Nobles who slipped out early were fined. For him, art was not a hobby. It was divinity. He compared himself to Apollo, god of music and the sun, and to Dionysus, lord of ecstasy and destruction. In that light, his cruelty takes on a disturbing logic. To make death into art, to sculpt fire around living bodies, was to elevate himself as both artist and god. Historians note his fascination with fire long before the Great Fire of 64 CE. He collected lamps, filled his halls with images of flame. When half of Rome burned, he was accused of watching from his palace, strumming his lyre as the city fell. Whether myth or fact, the story clung to him because it fit too well. He saw fire not as disaster, but as spectacle. To burn his concubines was to replicate on a smaller scale what Rome accused him of doing to the city itself. But psychology is never so simple. Beneath the artist was the child, the boy smothered by Agrippina's ambitions, the son who murdered his mother, the emperor haunted by her voice. Ancient writers describe Nero as both cowardly and sadistic, terrified of losing power, yet addicted to cruelty. Burning women may have been, in his mind, the ultimate expression of control. He had destroyed his mother, yes, but here he destroyed substitutes, women who reminded him of the womb he resented, of the dependence he despised. Modern terms might call this sadism, even psychopathy, a mind unable to empathize, taking pleasure in domination. But to the Romans, it was more than madness. It was hubris. To set fire to the bodies of concubines was to declare himself above mortal restraint, above human law. In his world, fire purified, fire consumed, fire reminded everyone that he alone decided who lived and who vanished. Tacitus observed that Nero rarely sought intimacy for its own sake. He sought novelty, shock, and fear. He once staged mock marriages to freedmen, dressing himself as bride or groom depending on whim, laughing at the boundaries he trampled. He castrated a boy named Sporus and called him his wife, parading him as a parody of Empress. If he could warp gender and ritual into grotesque theatre, why not twist desire itself into a pyre? One courtier wrote bitterly, he could not love, only rehearse, and every rehearsal ended in blood. What happens to a society ruled by such a man? When the emperor's pleasures are indistinguishable from executions, when even love is devoured by flame, how long can fear sustain loyalty? The psychology of Nero was not just personal madness. It was contagious. It infected the palace. Courtiers learned to smile while watching cruelty. Senators learned to applaud when horror was called art. Servants learned silence, for to speak was to burn as well. Fear was not simply a weapon. It was the oxygen that kept his rule alive. And yet, even fear has limits. For every concubine silenced in smoke, there were servants who whispered, senators who scribbled notes, historians who remembered. His attempt to turn death into spectacle may have given him fleeting pleasure, but it also gave his enemies endless ammunition. The emperor who claimed to be an artist became, in history's eyes, a monster. Aphoristic transition cuts sharp. What he could not love, he consumed. From the mind of Nero, we step back into the empire itself. For while his private rituals of fire spread terror within the palace, beyond those walls the consequences were far greater. Soldiers murmured, citizens cursed, senators plotted. A ruler who could burn his women alive could just as easily burn his city again. And the people of Rome began to wonder how long they could endure. The flames did not stay confined to the bedchamber. Rumor has a way of leaking through marble walls, of slipping past guards, of clinging to servants' whispers. Soon, the palace itself seemed cursed with smoke, whether real or imagined. Senators walking its halls swore they smelled burning silk, even when no fire burned. Slaves muttered of screams at night. And in Rome's taverns, citizens repeated the tale. Their emperor, who once let the city burn, now burned his women alive. Fear spread like a second fire. For if concubines could be consumed, what of senators? Who resisted him? What of generals who hesitated to obey? Every man and woman who entered his orbit knew that safety was an illusion. Even Poppaea, his beloved wife, had not been spared. Struck down, some said, by a single blow when she dared to challenge him. If a wife could die underfoot, how could a concubine live under silk? In a society built upon domination, these acts struck chords of both horror and recognition. Rome itself had long thrived on spectacle. Gladiators bled for cheers. Criminals burned in the arena. Slaves were crucified by the roadside. Violence was entertainment. But when such violence entered the emperor's bed, when intimacy itself became a stage for execution, Rome began to recoil. The line between public cruelty and private atrocity blurred until all feared they too might become props in his theatre. Tacitus tells us that after the Great Fire, the people began to whisper openly. Their city had turned to ash, their temples destroyed, their homes gone. Yet Nero built a palace more vast and gilded than any before, its ceilings inlaid with ivory, its halls decorated with images of flame. He invited guests to feast under revolving ceilings while incense drifted through the air. But even in these halls, many saw not luxury, but a mockery of their loss. For every pillar of marble was raised on the ruins of their homes. For every lamp that burned, they remembered the lamps overturned in concubines' chambers. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, began to shift uneasily. Soldiers muttered of omens, of gods offended by Nero's hubris. They too heard the rumors of burning women, of staged pyres disguised as passion. In barracks across the empire, men asked themselves, could they fight and die for a man who treated his own household with less mercy than he showed wild beasts in the amphitheatre? The Senate was worse. To oppose him openly was death, yet obedience was humiliation. They applauded his songs, they praised his plays, they bowed at his golden house. But in their hearts, disgust grew. And disgust, when coupled with fear, turns to conspiracy. Some scribbled notes in secret diaries, leaving for us words of warning. In the palace, fire was law. In the empire, silence was survival. Among the common people, Nero's image fractured. To some, he was still the patron of games, the emperor who showered the crowd with gifts of grain and gold. To others, he was no emperor at all, but an actor, a fraud who cared more for his voice than for their suffering. When rumors of the burning concubines spread, they were repeated not as gossip, but as truth, because it fit the man they already knew, the arsonist of Rome, the tyrant of the stage, the artist of death. How long can a ruler survive when fear infects not only his enemies, but his own guards, his own court, his own people? The consequences of his cruelty were not only personal, but political. His obsession with fire alienated the gods in the eyes of many. Priests warned that Vesta's eternal flame trembled, that divine patience was thinning. Others saw omens in the stars, in the flight of birds, in earthquakes that shook the empire during his reign. The emperor who made death into art was becoming, in the Roman imagination, a curse upon the city itself. And yet Nero did not relent. He built higher, staged grander games, forced nobles to cheer louder. He mistook silence for loyalty, obedience for devotion. But beneath the applause, resentment smouldered. Senators smiled as they plotted. Generals saluted as they conspired. Slaves carried wine while whispering revolt. His concubines burned, but in the ashes grew the seeds of rebellion. The rebellion began not with fire, but with whispers. In distant provinces, governors and generals, men weary of Nero's excess, began to doubt. In Spain, Galba refused orders. In Gaul, Vindex raised banners of revolt. At first, Nero dismissed them as petty malcontents. Had he not bought the people's love with games? Had he not filled the city with music and gold? But he misjudged. The empire was vast, and whispers travel faster than armies. The Senate, watching carefully, smelled opportunity. Senators who had clapped at his plays, who had feigned awe at his singing, began to shift in silence. They wrote to the rebels, weighing their chances, preparing to betray the man they still called Caesar to his face. The Praetorian Guard too wavered. These soldiers, once Nero's shield, began to ask what loyalty meant. Was it loyalty to Rome or to the arsonist who ruled her? And in the streets of Rome, his name turned sour. The people who once cheered him now cursed him. They remembered the great fire, the golden house built upon their ashes. They remembered the rumors of concubines burning behind locked doors. If he could treat women like kindling, what was the city but another stage set for destruction? Could an emperor so feared still command obedience when even fear itself had burned out? By the year 68 CE, the tide was unstoppable. Armies in Spain, Gaul, and Africa swore allegiance not to Nero, but to Galba. Messages poured into the Senate declaring their support. And then, the final blow, the Praetorian Guard deserted him. The very men sworn to defend his life declared him a public enemy. Nero fled his palace. The man who once basked in golden halls now rode through the dark, disguised, accompanied by a handful of trembling slaves. He begged for refuge in villas, but doors shut against him. He whispered, according to Suetonius, "Have I neither friend nor foe left?" In one account, he paused by the road, hearing the hooves of soldiers who hunted him, and muttered, "What an artist the world is losing." Even in his final hours, he clung not to empire, not to duty, but to performance. He wished to end his life as a tragedy sung by poets, not as the pitiful fugitive he had become. At last, cornered in a villa outside Rome, Nero faced the choice. Capture meant humiliation, torture, the jeers of the very Senate that once applauded him. He could not bear it. With trembling hands, he took a dagger. Ancient writers record that he faltered, that a servant pushed the blade into his throat when his courage failed. Thus ended Nero Claudius Caesar, the emperor who set fires both real and imagined, who turned his lovers into torches, who mistook cruelty for art. The aftermath was silence. Rome awoke to news of his death with mixed voices. Some rejoiced, some wept. Many stood stunned, for the figure who had dominated their lives with terror and spectacle